June 1945, Pacific Ocean. A Japanese submarine crew thought they'd be executed. Ensign Tanaka stood barefoot on the deck. He waited for the final command. He waited for the American bullet. His commander held a short sword, not for a fight, but for the end. But the shot never came. Instead, a US Navy officer brought water and clean bandages. Propaganda had promised torture. Policy delivered mercy. But for men trained to die, this kindness felt like a trap, a lie too great to believe. When your enemy spares your life but shatters your world, is that a rescue or just a slower kind of death? Tell us where you're listening from and the local time. We want to see how far these documented accounts reach. If you believe truth is stronger than myth, subscribe to keep it alive. In the deep Pacific waters near Guam, in the long, hot month of June 1945, the war was nearing its violent end. Far beneath the waves, the crew of the Japanese submarine, 401, knew only hunger, darkness, and the hum of machinery that had been their world for months. When the order came to surface, the air inside the steel hull turned thick with a silence worse than any alarm. Every man knew what it meant. They had failed. They were out of fuel, low on food, and caught under the shadow of the American Navy. Death was no longer a possibility. It was an appointment. The hatch opened with a groan, spilling pale, disoriented men onto the deck, their eyes squeezed shut against a sun they had not seen in weeks. They stood barefoot and trembling before the colossal grey form of a US destroyer, its guns trained directly on them. Ensign Hiroshi Tanaka felt the rough, hot steel under his feet and braced himself. He had been trained for this moment. His instructors had described it in horrifying detail. The Americans, they said, were savages who took no prisoners. They burned men alive. They tortured them for sport. The final duty of a Japanese sailor was to die before capture, to deny the enemy a trophy. He waited for the crack of rifles. He waited for the final, searing pain. At the front of the line of defeated men stood Commander Arizumi Tatsunosuke, captain of the I-401. He was a man bred for war, a follower of a code that offered only two paths, victory or death. He had chosen a third. To save the lives of the 140 men under his command, he had chosen surrender, the ultimate shame. In his hand, he clutched his family's short sword, the wakizashi, that was supposed to be his instrument of ritual suicide. He did not hold it as a weapon. His fight was over. He held it out, offering it to the American victors as a symbol of his submission, a final plea for a swift end. He, and every man behind him, expected to be shot right there on the deck. Instead of the rattle of machine gun fire, however, there was only the sound of boots on steel. American sailors moved forward, not with rifles raised, but with canteens in their hands. They did not shout insults. They moved with a quiet efficiency that was more baffling than any act of aggression. An American petty officer, a man with a tired face and dirt under his fingernails, approached the shivering Japanese sailors. He held out not a weapon, but a pack of cigarettes, offering them to his enemies as if they were colleagues at the end of a long day's work. Ensign Tanaka watched, his mind unable to process the scene. He had been taught that the enemy was a monster, a faceless demon, but the man in front of him was just a man. An American sailor steadied him with a hand on his arm, and through the haze of his fear and confusion, Tanaka heard a single, impossible word spoken in English. Safe. The word did not compute. Safety was a forgotten luxury, a concept that had no place in his world. He took the canteen offered to him, the cool metal a shock against his trembling fingers. He drank, and the fresh water was the most profound sensation he had ever known. It was the taste of life, given to him by the very people who were supposed to take it away. He looked at the Americans, at their faces, their hands, their movements, and he saw no hatred. He saw discipline. He saw men following orders. The rules of engagement for the United States Navy were clear, dictated not by rage, but by the articles of the 1929 Geneva Convention. This document, a world away from the battlefield, stipulated that prisoners of war were to be treated humanely. They were to be fed, sheltered, and given medical care. For the American sailors, this was policy. For Ensign Tanaka and the crew of the I-401, it was a miracle. Their military code, the ancient warrior tradition of Bushido, taught that surrender was a stain on one's honor, a debt that could only be paid in death. A captured soldier was considered spiritually dead, a disgrace to his family and his emperor. Propaganda had reinforced this belief. promising that American cruelty made death preferable to capture. But the reality unfolding on the deck of that destroyer was a direct contradiction to everything they had been taught. Here, mercy was not an emotion, it was a rule. The American medical officer, a quiet lieutenant named James Whitaker, began to tend to the crew's infected wounds and the effects of malnutrition. There were no harsh interrogations, no beatings, no final prayers. There were only bandages, bread, and the quiet murmur of procedure. The Japanese crew were searched, their names were recorded in a ledger, and they were led below deck, not to a brig, but to a space where they were given blankets. For men who had been prepared to die, this simple, structured humanity was a profound shock to the system. It was not a reprieve, it was a complete dismantling of their universe. Propaganda had promised a quick, violent end. Instead, policy had delivered a quiet, baffling continuation. Their bodies were being saved, but their minds were being pushed into an unknown territory, a place where enemy and savior looked exactly the same. They had prepared for an executioner, but were met by a caregiver, leaving them to wonder what new, unimaginable fate awaited them. The journey from the open sea to the American naval base was a slow, silent procession. For the crew of the I-401, each turn of the destroyer's propellers carried them further from their world and deeper into a bewildering new reality. Back in Japan, the military code was absolute. It was a creed carved into the soul of every soldier and sailor. Surrender was not an option. A man who gave himself up to the enemy was a ghost, a non-person who had forfeited his right to exist. This belief was reinforced daily through training and relentless propaganda. In contrast, the American sailors operated under a different code, one written on paper and enforced by command. The Geneva Convention of 1929 was not a suggestion, it was an order. By the middle of 1945, the United States had processed nearly 120,000 Japanese prisoners of war, each one a testament to this policy. But a submarine crew was different. They were a rare and valuable prize, operators of one of the most feared weapons in the naval arsenal. The Americans expected to find fanatics, men who would fight to the death with their bare hands rather than submit. They were prepared for resistance, for defiance, for men who would try to take their own lives rather than speak. On board the destroyer, Chief Petty Officer Daniel Morales, a U.S. Navy interrogator, prepared to meet these legendary warriors. Morales was a practical man, skilled at reading faces and finding the cracks in a person's armor. He had questioned hundreds of prisoners, and he knew the signs of zealotry. He expected to confront men filled with ideological fire, men who would spit at him before answering a question. What he met instead were shadows. The crew of the I-401 were not fanatics, they were boys and men, hollowed out by hunger and exhaustion, too weak to stand without assistance. Their defiance had been washed away by starvation and the cold reality of defeat. They did not have the strength for hatred. They had only the energy for fear. This quiet, brittle humanity presented a challenge for men like Morales and for every American sailor on that ship. The policy of mercy was not an easy one to follow. Many of these sailors had lost friends and brothers to the war in the Pacific. They knew that Japanese forces rarely rescued American survivors from the sea. The impulse for revenge was a powerful, human thing. But the orders from their commanders were strict and unwavering. Prisoners are to be treated in accordance with the laws of war. This was not about forgiveness, it was about discipline. It was a demonstration that American strength was measured not just by the power of its guns, but by the strength of its principles. This discipline took the form of small, concrete acts of humanity. Lieutenant James Whitaker, the medical officer, worked with a calm focus, cleaning infected wounds and distributing vitamin tablets. He saw not enemy combatants, but human bodies in need of repair. He stitched a deep gash on a young sailor's arm with the same steady hands he used for his own shipmates. A corpsman, seeing the terror in the eyes of another young prisoner, did something entirely unexpected. He took out his harmonica and played a soft, simple tune. The music was a language everyone understood, a small island of peace in an ocean of war. Ensign Tanaka watched these moments, each one a tiny chisel chipping away at the foundation of his beliefs. He was handed a thick wool blanket, and as the American sailor wrapped it around his thin shoulders, the gesture felt impossibly gentle. One of his crewmates would later write, "They wrapped me as if I were their brother." This quiet compassion was more disorienting than any cruelty could have been. Cruelty was expected. It was familiar. This, however, was alien. It was a kindness that felt like a riddle with no answer. The mystery only deepened when American officers began examining the personal effects confiscated from the Japanese crew. They found letters, hundreds of them, written to and from families back home. The pages were filled with warnings from parents and wives, echoing the official government line. If you are ever captured, the Americans will torture you without mercy. They will dishonor you. They will execute you. Do not let this happen. Die with your honor intact. These letters were not artifacts of a distant policy. They were the living heart of the prisoners' fear. The Americans were reading the very script of terror that had been playing in the minds of these men for years. And so, every act of decency became an act of defiance against that script. A piece of bread was not just food, it was evidence. A clean bandage was not just medicine, it was a counter-argument. The cigarette offered on the deck, the fresh water from the canteen, the soft notes of a harmonica. Each gesture was a quiet rebuttal to a lifetime of propaganda. For Ensign Tanaka and his crewmates, the physical war was over, but a new, internal battle had just begun. They were trapped between two impossible truths. The world they were told existed, and the world they were now seeing with their own eyes. The slow, steady rhythm of the ship's engines was the only constant as the Japanese prisoners were transported across the vastness of the Pacific. They were taken first to Pearl Harbor, the very place where their nation had struck a victorious blow years earlier. Now, they passed through its waters as defeated men, their heads bowed. The irony, a heavy, unspoken weight in the humid air. From there, they were loaded onto another vessel bound for the United States mainland. With each passing day, the fear that had been temporarily quieted by the Americans' surprising decency began to fester again. The small kindnesses, the water, the food, the blankets, started to feel less like mercy and more like a prelude to a more elaborate, more terrifying end. They were being kept alive. They whispered to one another in the dark. For a reason. Perhaps they were to be put on public display, shamed before the American people. Or perhaps they were being fattened up for a more gruesome execution. The propaganda they had been fed for years was a powerful poison, and it was not so easily purged from their minds. Their arrival at a prisoner of war camp in the American heartland was the moment they had been dreading. As they were marched from the transport trucks, surrounded by armed guards, the silence was absolute. This, they thought, was the end of the line. Ensign Tanaka watched a hawk circle in the sky above and thought of home. He closed his eyes, preparing for the final command. But instead of being lined up against a wall, they were led into a long wooden building. Inside, there were not shackles and interrogation rooms, but rows of shower heads. The guards motioned for them to undress. For the first time in months, they felt the cleansing shock of hot water on their skin, washing away the grime of the submarine and the sea. Afterward, they were given clean uniforms, simple but whole, and led to a mess hall. There, they were served a meal of bread, stew, and coffee. The food was plain, but it was hot and plentiful. For men who had been surviving on scraps of rice, it was a feast. One sailor, clutching his slice of bread, was so overcome with suspicion that he could not eat. In a diary he kept hidden, he later wrote a single, stark line: "I bit the bread to test it. If poison, let it be quick." This profound gap between expectation and reality was not an accident. It was a reflection of two starkly different approaches to war. In the camps run by the Japanese military across Asia, Allied prisoners faced a brutal, unforgiving existence. Of the tens of thousands of American prisoners held by Japan, more than 27,000 died in captivity. That was a death rate of nearly 40%, a staggering number born of starvation, disease, and outright cruelty. In the camps across the United States, however, the story was entirely different. The death rate for Japanese prisoners of war was less than 1%. The numbers laid bare the moral chasm between the two war machines. For the American command, adherence to the laws of war was a measure of national character. For the men on the ground, it was simply their job. Months passed. The initial terror of the Japanese sailors gave way to a dull, listless routine. Then, one day in August of 1945, everything changed again. The prisoners were assembled and told to listen to a radio broadcast. Through the static came a voice that was both strange and sacred, a voice no ordinary Japanese citizen had ever heard before, the voice of Emperor Hirohito himself. He spoke of ending the war, of accepting the unacceptable. The news fell upon them like a physical blow. Their nation had fallen. Their God had spoken of surrender. The world they had fought for, The beliefs they had been willing to die for had ceased to exist. In the weeks that followed, the atmosphere in the camp shifted once more. By late 1945, the war was officially over, and the process of repatriation began. The Americans were not preparing for executions, they were preparing to send them home. But as the day of their departure neared, a new and insidious fear began to grow among the prisoners. Mercy had saved them from their enemy, but what awaited them back in Japan? They had survived, but in a culture where surrender was the ultimate dishonor, survival itself could be a death sentence. They began to wonder if the kindness they had been shown was the cruelest trick of all, preserving them only to be shamed, cast out, or even executed as cowards by their own people. The Americans had spared their lives, but their home might still destroy their souls. The journey home was the longest of all. The crew of the I-401, now clothed and fed by their former enemies, sailed back across the same ocean where they had once hunted. They were returning not to the empire of Japan they had left, a nation of divine purpose and military might, but to a land broken and occupied. The fear of an American execution had been replaced by a more complex dread, the fear of their own people. As their ship pulled into a Japanese port, they saw the devastation firsthand. But it was not the ruined buildings that struck them with the greatest force. It was the look in the eyes of the people on the shore. They saw no heroes returning. They saw ghosts. When Ensign Hiroshi Tanaka finally walked the streets of his hometown, he felt like a stranger. The neighbors who had once celebrated his departure now turned away, their faces a mixture of pity and contempt. He had lived while their sons and husbands had died. His survival was an uncomfortable reminder of the nation's total defeat. For many of the returnees, the welcome was a cold silence. Some were openly spat upon. They were living symbols of a failure so complete that the old rules no longer made sense. Commander Arazumi Tatsunosuke returned to his family, carrying the short sword he had once intended to use to end his own life. The Americans had respectfully returned it to him, an acknowledgement of his rank, but in his own country, it felt like an emblem of his disgrace. He had not died in battle. He had not fallen on his blade. He had surrendered. By the old code, he had failed his emperor and his ancestors. The sword, once a source of family pride, became a secret. He did not display it in his home. Instead, he wrapped it in cloth and placed it at the bottom of a wooden chest, hidden away like a shameful truth. The sword's story, the story of American mercy, of a code of conduct upheld in the heart of a brutal war, was a story he could not tell. In a nation struggling to rebuild its identity, there was no room for such complicated truths. The official silence was deafening. The government did not speak of the prisoners who returned. It was easier to focus on the heroic dead than the complicated living. But a truth, once witnessed, does not simply disappear. It lives on in quiet places. Behind closed doors, in the privacy of their homes, the survivors of the I-401 began to speak. They did not speak to their neighbors or to officials, but to their children. As the years turned into decades, Ensign Tanaka, now a father himself, would tell his son the story. The Americans, he would say quietly, did not kill us. They gave us water. It was a simple statement, a fragment of a memory, but it was a powerful counter-narrative to the years of propaganda. These quiet testimonies, passed down from father to son, kept the memory of mercy alive, a small flame of truth protected from the winds of national shame and political silence. The story of what happened on that destroyer deck became a private family legend, a testament to a day when the world turned upside down. Slowly, as Japan healed and a new generation began to ask questions about the war, these private stories started to surface. Historians and documentary filmmakers began collecting oral histories, seeking out the men who had been erased from the official narrative. In museums dedicated to peace, the paradox of the war began to be explored. The reality that even as battles raged with unimaginable ferocity, acts of profound humanity occurred. The discipline of the American forces, their adherence to the laws of war, became a subject of study. The simple act of a sailor offering a cigarette became a data point in a larger story about restraint. In 1972, one of the former crewmen of the I-401, now an old man, wrote a letter to a historical society. In it, he reflected on his life, his capture, and the long, silent years that followed. Honor, he wrote, was not to die with a sword. Honor was to live long enough to speak the truth. In the end, the sword of Commander Arazumi came out of its chest. It was not a symbol of shame, but a symbol of a different kind of courage, the courage to live, to remember, and to bear witness. It remained sheathed, intact. It had not been broken in suicide, nor was it seized in violence. It was carried home because mercy had stayed the hand of both the victor and the vanquished. They thought they would be executed. Instead, they were sent home safely. That was the day mercy defeated myth.